It's sort of a funny way to do this, to sort of see the future first and then talk about the present. As Simon mentioned, we are sort of the arbiters right now of political advertising spending. We've been at this since about 1997, as I'm sort of fond of saying. Front row seats are great unless it's political ads or sumo wrestling. So what we do is really service clients three ways. We provide them basically in-campaign real-time analysis of where ads are running, what ads look like. We push new creative to the clients, but we also do a lot of ad hoc research, everything from retrieving creative to doing custom reporting and custom requests. We're part of TNS. Our coverage for politics right now is pretty much limited to the stodgy old broadcast media. Where we're right now in about 132 of 210 markets. We'll be up to all the markets by the end of this year. We are covering in every state, and we do national cable, but not local cable. Cover inside Beltway print, mostly opinion leader. We do some internet. We're starting to do things like tracking blogs and even research on things like media habits. Basically what I want to do today is just briefly kind of run through our forecast of the 2008 elections. Talk about some of the changes to the political marketplace, talk about some of our forecast and where these dollars are going to come, a little bit about timing. I think it's at least a state law or a district law, but maybe it's federal law now, that if you have media in your title and you're talking to more than 10 people, you have to mention the internet. So I'll spend just a couple of seconds on that, and then just a few thoughts of where we're going to go from there. First, the political marketplace. Again, it's very unique, and people that deal with real advertisers, I'm sure, learn this the hard way, that there's really nothing quite like the way political spends its money on advertising. It's a 4-year business cycle where no 2 years, no 2 consecutive years are alike. So in other words, your year 1 is your off year coming out of a presidential, and your year 4 is usually a presidential, and you've got midterm elections wedged in there in the middle. There's been incredible upward growth in ad spending. A lot of this is due to the fact that now you have multiple moving pieces in every campaign between parties and issue groups, and even traditional advertisers are weighing in now. Changes to the campaign finance law, the McCain-Feingold bill, in essence doubled the amount of money that campaigns have available to them. That money went immediately to what was already the biggest line item in their budget, which was television advertising. And then we see more campaigns using TV, and I think that's being mostly driven by decreasing in editing costs. In other words, literally the McCain campaign was making their TV commercials on a laptop. So when a presidential campaign is doing advertising, not in a high-cost production studio, you can see that the door is pretty much open to anybody running for office now to produce spots. And then finally, it's events-driven. I mean, by events, I mean obviously elections, but obviously things that happen during elections tend to impact ad spending. The best example of that is when Joe Lieberman lost his primary in Connecticut. You saw some of the safest members of Congress ramping up their TV buys almost within the next week. I think the idea being, if Joe Lieberman could lose, anybody could have lost in 2006. As you'll see, the growth in ad spending has gone from just around $1 billion in 2002 to over 2.6 billion in 2006. Why is that? Well, we talked about sort of all the challenges right now into running commercials. The best analogy I can give is what has happened to political advertising and political communication is basically the same approach that Americans take when we go overseas to foreign countries that don't speak English, and we run into people that don't speak our language. Our first instinct is to always talk louder. We say, you know where the bathroom is, like somehow they'll understand it better. So, that's in essence what's happened to political advertising, is their answer to the fact that it's always going to be a one day of sale business. There's not a situation where you can evaluate quarter over quarter, because once you win or lose an election, you're either moving on to your next election or you're looking for your next job. So a lot of this is just driven by the fact that they've got to get the message out, and they've got to do it in a finite amount of time. And winning and losing is more important than how much waste there is. A lot of the strategy has been about rerunning the last campaign adjusted for inflation. In other words, what you see campaigns do is they go and they dust off the playbook from the last election. They pull the media schedule out a couple more weeks and they add 20% to it, and that's their campaign strategy. They still view TV as the best megaphone to drive independent voters. And as you can see by comparison in 2006 to the 2.6 billion that we saw, These aren't necessarily apples to apples because we don't track local cable, so we're really estimating that. Some of that $2.6 billion includes things like public affairs advertising that's got election nuance related. So it's not necessarily apples to apples, but as you can see, broadcast TV has been the weapon of choice. I use this graph just because it shows the insanity of how campaigns spend their money. If you look at the access, it's the amount of money spent versus the available voters. In other words, by looking at that chart, basically campaigns spend the most money when they have the least amount of people to influence or least amount of customers to get. There's no other business in the world that I think spends their money like that. If you look at our forecast for 2008, we're looking at a $3 billion election for TV ads. We're currently at 13% and climbing at a record pace, thank you. What's driving the spending is the historic presidential race we've had, both the candidates, the process, and the money they're raising. There's a very competitive state and federal race backdrop underneath the presidential race. In other words, we're picking up pretty much where we left off with House and Senate races in 2006, as well as a number of things going on at the state level that are also driving spending. There's a lot of money on the sidelines right now waiting to come in the form of interest groups, and you're looking at $300 to $400 million additional to that $3 billion that'll be spent in advocacy advertising related to public policy and legislation. Where we stand now is the first number there is our forecast for the year, that what will get spent combined by candidates and what has been spent already. As you can see, the $108 million has been spent basically on broadcast television since January of 2008. Parties have only kicked in $106,000, but that's about to change. And group spending is right now at about $18 million. If you look at the presidential primary process in total, we're over $231 million spent on TV ads for that process right now. With all apologies to Duncan Hunter, who actually started his advertising in December of 2006, this began in earnest in February of 2007. Democratic candidates have combined to spend over $130 million. That number looks really big when put next to what Republican candidates spend, which is a combined $58 million. Majority of spending by groups right now has been in the promotion of issues and not going directly after candidates. So things like AARP's Divided We Fail, League of Conservation Voters. There's a number of groups that have been promoting their issues in the context of the ongoing election. That's probably about to change as well. And then ad spending, again, because of the sort of quirky calendar that was put together and the sort of emphasis on being an early winner and getting the nomination wrapped up quickly, and we all saw how well that's working right now, is close to $90 million of that $231 million was spent between the states of Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. If you break down the individual candidates so far, Barack Obama has spent close to $70 million on TV ads alone. He's outspent Senator Clinton in 38 out of 44 states thus far. And of late, 41% of his advertising expenditures in a dollar form have been going into the primetime day part, which is the most expensive television that you can buy. Generally not something that political campaigns go near just because of the cost factor. His strategy has been to go on first, focus the majority of his ad money has gone into the largest population centers in each state. He's used some local and national surrogates in his ads, and he's been using a lot of niche media to fortify within different demographics, especially with things like cable, and especially things like radio, where he's actually bought a lot of radio where he uses very young voice talent. Hillary Clinton, on the other hand, has spent $42 million on TV. Her spending has been heaviest in the must-win states, and she's the first to use negative spots in this election. We'd be remiss not to mention John McCain, because if we handed out awards at CMAG, we would probably have to give him the ROI of the century, spending $10 million to get his party's nomination. Essentially an all-in strategy in New Hampshire, which rode the momentum, where actually the primary calendar actually worked for his campaign. And his strategy has been very disciplined. He's used very few messages in the ads that he uses. He plays over and over and over. Just to talk a little bit more, right now as far as others in this race, not a lost reference, but we know that Mayor Bloomberg is at least not running at the top of any ticket. We know that Nader is in. I'm sure we'll see others. Groups right now is combined to spend over $50 million in the primary, but if you add up the pledges that you read in the paper, that number is right now somewhere in the $700 million for liberal and conservative groups that are ready to engage this race when we get there. If you look at House and Senate races right now, again, we're looking at this to be somewhere in the $200 to $250 million all said and done. We're very early in the process. As you can see, only $3.3 million by candidates so far. In the House, it's a little higher, 13.3, due to primaries and retirements. But again, when you're looking at politics, and we've gone down and broken out about the last 6 elections, you're literally looking at about 60% of the total ad money flowing through in probably the last 65 to 70 days. So as you can see, we're still tracking there. The Senate, because it is a sea of red, it is not a good map for Republicans. Could impact some of the ways that advertising money gets spent in Senate races. The House, obviously, you're looking at a historic number of competitive seats, and retirements are adding primaries at this point. State and local governors, as you can see, there's not many this year, about 11. We suspect that to be somewhere in the $100 million range. The one thing I would point attention to is where you're going to see a lot of spending, and we probably at this point have underestimated, is in ballot measures. California alone, we saw over $100 million spent in February. One of the unintended consequences of this quirky primary schedule was that a lot of states did not move their state and local primaries. They just moved their presidential primaries up. So in states like California and others, you're literally looking at 3 waves of statewide elections. So California, which has become very fond of recalls and ballot measures, are likely going to push us past that $230 million number. Again, as I covered in just the talking points there, on the issue side, we're obviously energy, environment, telecom, and healthcare have been some of the most active areas for issue ad spending thus far. Now, again, as promised, I have to talk about at least the new media in the context of internet advertising, and just a few of the observations that we've seen there. It's been, by and large, used mostly by the top-tier presidential campaigns. Now, obviously, there's a lot going on sort of below our radar screen, so I would preface at that. We track, again, about 3,000 of the most trafficked sites. A lot of the internet stuff is going to much more localized blogs. Most of the messages are designed around fundraising and grassroots. We calculate no more than $4 million has been spent on internet advertising at this point. And most of the sites that are being local are top news sites, both local and national, many ideology-driven sites, some that match up with specific demographics, sports and election-related advertising. In politics, and especially in political strategy, perception is reality. So the perception that is created off of this election will dictate likely where you'll see the new medias accelerate into the next elections. So far, there have been a few very highly publicized mistakes with online advertising. I would just sort of pay attention to those as you go along in the news, because that's the thing that sort of the consultants will use in their next round of elections to discourage things like this kind of internet advertising. Again, some of the events that we're going to watch just down the stretch, which will impact sort of timing and ad spending, is just, will anybody actually win the Democratic race? If so, when will they secure a nomination, why and how? That's going to obviously have a lot to do with when ad spending takes place. If the Democratic race does go to the convention, I would argue at this point that you may be seeing a significant lull in fundraising and spending during the summer months. That may trickle down into other races as well. General election ads, they have begun. I mean, the DNC has started ads that target McCain. Obviously, McCain has started to run a few ads, but the dollars are very insignificant, and there is no sort of geographic rhyme or reason to these. I suspect things like national cable may be well positioned when the candidates start advertising to superdelegates. The battleground, again, it's very much up in flux. I think it depends on who you ask, but we hear that there's going to be a different battleground if it's McCain-Obama or if it's McCain-Clinton. So again, I think it's going to be very much at the mercy of the Democratic race to figure out sort of what the actual battleground looks like as far as where most of the ad dollars are going to flow. And at this point, fundraising, again, is really the sound of one hand clapping when you compare the Democrats to the Republicans. Obviously, Senator McCain has said that he's going to go on public financing and try and basically use the party's infrastructure to carry his message. So that, again, will likely have an impact on how some of the ad money is spent and when. And then just looking ahead to 2009, it is the start of a new political business cycle. I think, again, pay very close attention to the strategies that are given the most credit and success in the high-profile races this year. I would caution to say one thing, is that I don't think Senator Obama's strategy and Senator McCain's strategy, for that matter, are strategies that can be replicated. So, I think that there'll be a lot of takeaways from what they did individually, but I think when you start looking at the next round of presidential strategies, the candidates would probably be well served to look backwards to 2004. The issues right now that are most prevalent in the advertising and the rhetoric, again, the economy. trade, healthcare, energy, and Iraq is very far down the list. We looked at, for an upcoming newsletter we're putting out, we're breaking down sort of the rhetoric on the energy issue. And close to $71 million has been spent so far by candidates talking about things like global warming, gas prices, energy shortages. By comparison, only about $22 million have been spent talking about the war in Iraq. 2010 will be a very big year for governor's races. Really, actually, this year and the next year will be because of redistricting. Governors and who control state houses will have a big role in how redistricting is done. And again, I think that's going to push a lot of outside money into governor's races. And I would argue, too, that I think there will be a lot of discussion about redoing the primary calendars going forward. So just a couple of things to look at. And at this point, I'll turn it back to Simon and to the panel here.